comes to mind when you hear the term people of the North? For some, it's scripture prophecy. And for others, it's this scene from the Disney movie Frozen, an obscure group of people who live in the farmost northern parts of the world. They survive in freezing cold temperatures, wear funny pointed shoes, and seem to have a lot to do with reindeer. This almost sounds like the North Pole, doesn't it? Like Santa's elves. I remember the first time I saw the movie Frozen, I was very drawn to it because of these people, because of this culture. It was a culture that I was not familiar with, but I was really fascinated by their clothing and the bright colors. And later, in Frozen Part 3, I felt that these people strongly resembled Native Americans. I was very intrigued. Then one day I came across this group of people called the Sami, the people of the North. And once I began to learn about who these people were and who they are, I learned that the movie Frozen was inspired by these people. And then I got excited. But it wasn't until I had a personal experience of my own that I started to dig into the history of the Sami. My interest in researching these people of the North began a couple years ago when I came across this group of people from these northern countries, and I felt like these people sort of looked like my family. I felt like I was looking at photos of people in my family, and I've heard that happening before when people discover where their roots come from and they start researching those cultures. They'll come across people in photos or people in those countries, and they'll notice these physical features about these people that resemble physical features in their own family, and they finally feel this kind of, sense of connection. This is where I come from. This is where I inherited most of my genetics from, was these people. So I had that experience, and I became very fascinated with these Sami people. I began to wonder, do I really have a connection to these tribes, to these people, or is it just because I know part of my DNA comes from these regions? Well, time went by and I sort of forgot about this topic until a friend of mine reminded me about it and began to revisit it with me. And then I had a genetics test done. I had had your typical DNA test done multiple times through Ancestry, through 23andMe, and through some others. But this time I decided to have it done through a company called Living DNA, and they specialize in Europe. So they will tell you your haplogroup and also your mitochondrial DNA, which is your mother's side. And it's very direct. So for your father, it's your father's 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 father's, pretty much all the way back to Adam. So it's that whole patriarchal line. Same for your mother. It's your mother's 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 mother, all the way back to Eve. So it's that whole maternal line. And so it is pretty awesome. Now you can only find out haplogroups through the male DNA. So we tested my dad, and come to find out, he had two unique and rare haplogroups. His father's haplogroup being T, which is the same as Thomas Jefferson's. In fact, Thomas Jefferson's paternal lineage traces all the way back to a rare indigenous European group. And then my father's mitochondrial DNA haplogroup from his mother happens to be haplogroup U. More specifically, U4, though the majority of Sami people belong to the U5b haplogroup, a small portion falls into U4. I was so excited when I learned this about my dad's DNA. I began watching videos and reading books and doing everything I could to learn about these Sami people. And this first video I came across, I was watching it with some of my children, and the first thing they said is we saw these images come up. As you see this one right here on the screen, they said, "Mom, they look like they could be related to us. So there was that confirmation that it wasn't just me. My kids were seeing it too. In fact, this picture right here, I felt resembled a little bit of myself. And these were black and white photos from the 1800s that somebody had colorized and put to music. And it just really spoke to me as I looked at these images on my screen and I looked into the eyes of these Sami people. It just spoke to me, and I felt like they were wanting me to learn more about them. And so that began my research into this video. Here's another photo that popped up in that video. This one looks like my oldest child, my son, Gabe. Just look at the comparison here. In fact, when my other kids saw this photo, they said the exact same thing. They thought this really looked like Gabe. And this got me excited about having my kids take a DNA test. So that's what I gave them for Christmas last year, was DNA tests. I was super excited to see just what DNA or what genetics they inherited. And I was confident that my oldest son, Gabe, would definitely inherit the Swedish side of the family. I was confident that the DNA results would reveal that the largest percentage of his DNA would come from Sweden, the Swedish side of our family. My husband is 100% German, and I am a mix. I'm a mix of everything in Europe and Scandinavia, but I just knew that my son had inherited the Swedish part of our family DNA. So I was excited to find out. Now, it is fascinating how genetics work. These are my mom's results from her DNA test. She's 35% Swedish and then 29% English and Northwestern Europe. Now, it's funny because her father is an even mix of Swedish and German. So his father was from Sweden and his mother was from Germany. My mom inherited 0% from the German DNA. She did not get any of it in her genes. However, I will say that that part of Germany, it was actually considered Prussia, and today it is owned by Russia. So it's far enough east, I guess you could say northeast, that it would make sense that it wouldn't show up under Germany in her DNA results. Now here's what's crazy. These are my DNA results. I have way more percentage of Swedish DNA in me than my mom does. I'm at 44% compared to her 35%. I'm even further removed from that part of the family because I also have part of my dad, and he's a mix of English and Danish and Swiss. Yet I inherited almost 10% more of the Swedish DNA than my mom, whose father is a direct descendant from a Swedish native. And I feel like my physical features look like an even mix of my mom and my dad. So it's crazy to see how much I actually inherited from my mother's father. In fact, here's a funny story. When I was 18 years old and I visited Germany for the first time, we went on a tour of southern Germany and we went to Neuschwanstein Castle, and I was standing there on the bridge that overlooks the castle, and there was a man there native to that area. He had on the lederhosen and the hat with the feather, and he was yodeling, and he walks over to me and he says in English, "I know where you're from. I can tell you're not from here, but I also can tell where you're from." And so I smiled at him and I said, "Where am I from?" He said, "You're from Sweden. You're definitely Swedish. I recognize a Swede when I see one." And I laughed so hard and I nodded and I said, "Yep, you're right. I am Swedish." Because it was partly true. It was in my ancestry, so I knew surely it had to be in my DNA, but I wouldn't know until years later when I took this DNA test that truly it was the largest portion of my DNA. Well, we got back the results for my son's DNA test, and he was an even split. 26% Swedish and 26% German. So that was pretty awesome. He's 50-50 between my husband and I, with the largest part of his DNA percentage. It's so fascinating to me to see that Swedish gene, that part of our DNA, being passed down from generation to generation, and it seems to be dominant. And I noticed that whenever we randomly print temple names to take to the temple, whenever we print names for my son, the worldwide family tree automatically prints out names from Sweden every single time. So I've been taking note of that. And I also noticed for my daughter who's mostly German in her DNA, whenever we randomly print temple names for her, they are always names from Germany. And then I noticed it was the same for my other daughter. The part of her DNA that's the strongest, those are the names that print out. And so I found that really fascinating, and I couldn't help but feel there's a reason for that. There's a reason that these ancestors seem to connect with us. And they want us to do their work. They want to be involved in blessing our lives as we bless theirs. And I think the neatest part about family history, it's not just finding their names or their individual stories, but it's learning about where they came from, their people, their history, their culture, and their traditions. And this is what led me to the next part of my story. Now, the Sami people inhabit these areas on this map, the outward, most northern part of Scandinavia into Russia. So you can see it's broken down on this map into the different tribes. It's broken down by colors. And I have ancestry from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Now, here is a picture of my dad. And the way that his DNA breaks down is he is 59% Great Britain and Ireland, and 40% Europe, and 34% of that 40% is Scandinavia. So this is really interesting because he has Danish on both sides of his family. So his mother has the Christensen side, who's from Denmark, and his father are the Willardsons, who also come from Denmark. Yet he inherited the majority of his DNA from Great Britain. But he looks a lot like his mother, who has the haplogroup that traces back to the Sami people. Here's where the story gets even crazier. So this photo right here is of an ancestor on my dad's side of the family who was actually adopted. His name was George Keller. In fact, I've talked about him before in an old blog post in my old blog archives, and I have a video coming up this year where I'm going to talk more about him. He has a very interesting story. Anyways, he is actually a mix of his mother and father, his mother being from Sweden, she immigrated from Sweden, and his father was an African American who was not married to his mother. So his mother at the time was unfaithful to her husband, and when he found out, he said to her, "You need to get rid of that baby, and if you don't, you cannot come out to California and be with me. I will divorce you. So you choose between me or the baby." So when she was traveling through, she came through Sanpete County, and she was passing through Manti, and she felt that the people there were very kind in that small town. My great-great-grandmother fell in love with this cute little baby, and when she heard the story from his mother, she had compassion, and she offered to adopt little George. So that was the deal. She adopted him, and he became a member of the family. Fast forward to the mid-2000s, I'm visiting my grandma, and I come across this old photo album in her home. So I ask her if I can look through it, and she says, "Oh, of course, everybody knows about that photo album." I said, "Well, I've never seen it before." So I'm flipping through the pages, and I come across this photo right here, and I said, "Who in the world is George Keller? He looks exactly like my dad." There's a picture of my dad side by side. And my dad said, "Oh, well, that's my uncle. That's Uncle George. Everybody remembers Uncle George." So I thought, okay, no wonders they look alike. They're related. It's an uncle. And I said, "Oh, okay, well, that makes sense, but why have I never heard of him?" So my dad told me the story, and I said, "Wait a minute. So you're not even blood related to him, yet you guys look like you could be brothers." And to even know that he was half African American, it's crazy to see that resemblance. Well then, this week, as I was again doing research for this video, and I was researching my father's mother's mitochondrial DNA group. it took me to a group of people in Russia, in Siberia, called the Mansi people, but by Russians they are known as the Havs Samiska. There's that root word Sami. And as I began to look up photos of these Samiska people, the very first photo I see is this photo right here of this man who, again, looks just like my dad. In fact, if you do a lineup, he also looks just like Uncle George Keller. With Uncle George having a Swedish mother, it would make sense that he has those Swedish genetics. And my dad has his genetics coming from Denmark. These are both part of those upper northern countries. And my dad's mitochondrial DNA traces to the Sami people of Siberia. So we have these connections through my dad. We also have Swedish connections through my mom. And I'm seeing these photos of different Sami tribes, and I'm seeing strong resemblances of family members within my own tree. So yes, I was excited. I felt that instant curiosity and connection. I wanted to learn more about these people. And as I began to learn, I also began to see my pay attention number everywhere, 144, which represents the gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. So here I was reading about the history of the Russian tribes, which I learned all became united under the rule of King Oleg. There was my pay attention number 144 as it happened to be 11:44 a.m. And right as I'm recording this part of the video, it is 14 minutes and 44 seconds into this edited portion of the video. The number representing the gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel as I'm talking about tribes uniting in Russia. That's my pay attention number that says pay attention. And I began to see more of my pay attention numbers as I continued to study this topic of the Sami people. Here on this video of the Sami people, also known as Laplanders, I see the number 11 and 23, which to me always suggests 11 o'clock p.m., almost midnight, and the 23rd hour of the day, almost midnight. So to me, I felt this was a pay attention reminder of how important it is to study out our family history. It's almost midnight. We're running out of time. We need to do all that we can to find our family, to build up our tree. And also, we know right up about midnight, we will have an incredible fulfillment of prophecy regarding these people of the North. We're going to talk about that towards the end of this video. And you just can't make this up. Right when I said what I said, that recording was 14 minutes and 4 seconds. There it is again, 1:44. Pay attention. I decided to start my research by looking into the meaning of the name Sami. So I looked it up and I learned that Sami is related to one who hears. In Finnish, Sami is derived from the Hebrew name Samuel, which means name of God or God heard. Right away, I felt that the origins of these indigenous people were a people of God, a people who God heard. In fact, right when I just said that about the name of the Sami people, I looked up and this particular video was at 44 minutes and 41 seconds. There's that pay attention number, 144, represents the gathering of these lost tribes. I felt that said, pay attention. Pay attention to what you just said. Now, speaking of Israel, as I began to look at the Sami people's clothing and the way that they dressed, I couldn't help but notice similarities to ancient Israel. Notice the headdress of the men and the women, the girdles around their waist, and the robes. I was excited to see the similarities between ancient Israel, these Sami people, and indigenous tribes all over the world. Here we have some indigenous women of Kyrgyzstan, which borders China. And similar to Native American and Sami women, these Kyrgyzstan women hunt with bows and arrows. Here are Mongolian women in their traditional clothing. Again, you see the bright colors, you see the headdress, you see the scarves and the girdles, you see the patterns, you see the similarities to ancient Israel. In fact, the dresses that these indigenous Mongolian young women are wearing strongly resemble the dresses that Anna and Elsa wear in the movie Frozen. Here is an image of a woman from the Kohari tribe in North America. She's wearing traditional clothing, and I found it interesting that the Kohari tribe is said to have descended from or broken off from a tribe in North Carolina, a tribe that believed there was one and only one chief and great God who had been and always existed from all eternity. They believed in and practiced organized religion, which included priests as distinct spiritual leaders. Again, we see the similarities with the headdress, the robes, the scarf that hangs around the neck all the way down the length of the robe, the patterns, the colors. And I'd like to point out the modesty. All of these similar indigenous tribes who resemble ancient Israel have that modesty with their women. Here is a photo of an Iroquois woman with her children. And you look at it and you see again those similarities. Look at the shoes, the pants, the dresses, the headdress. It looks so much like the Sami people and those of ancient Israel. And here are some depictions of various Russian women wearing different types of headdress. You see how their hair is covered in the front. This very much resembles the women of ancient Israel. You even see these similarities in the different types of folk hats that Russian women wore. And you see the similarities in this indigenous Greek woman. Look at what she's wearing. Look what's adorned around her neck. Look at her headdress. Look at her robe. The patterns and the bright colors are uncanny. Here we have some nomadic tribes from India. And as I looked at this image, I happened to notice the time. It was 11:44 p.m. There was that pay attention number again, 1:44. I looked at that and I pondered as I observed their traditional clothing, which again very much resembles ancient Israel. In fact, I got thinking about the word India, and I got thinking about the term Indians, how Native Americans were given that name Indians, and nowadays that name is considered offensive. It was no different with the Sami people. They had a name that was given to them. They were called the Laplanders, and today that word is considered offensive. I decided to look up the meaning of the word India because to me it sounded very much like the word indigenous. So I looked it up and it said that the word India was taken from the Indus River, which runs through India. So there was the word Indus. I then looked up the origins of the word indigenous. Turns out it's Latin, and it comes from the old Latin word Indu. So there was that word Indu, which sounds very much like Indus. It's the same word, but without the S. And this word happens to mean endo in Greek, which means within. And the end of the word genus derives from the Latin word gegnere, meaning to beget, from the root gene, meaning to produce, give birth, and beget. Isn't it interesting that the word Indian, which was given to the Native Americans, which became an offensive name, actually has root words that mean indigenous? Here we have pictures of tribes spanning clear down into Africa. And again, you see the similarities with the colorful beads, what it is they're wearing around their necks, the patterns, the bright colors, the headdress. It's all there. Here we have a woman from a North American tribe, and you see the feathers on her headdress. And I'm going to show you more feathers within other tribes all over the world. But it's clear to see that at some point these tribes intermixed. At some point they crossed paths. At some point they had a connection. They knew each other. There are too many similarities to suggest otherwise. Here is a Native American woman who, when I looked at this photo, I was reminded of this depiction of Ruth. Now, I think it's interesting when you look at the bottom of her dress, you'll see a border of crosses. Now, this could have symbolized north, south, east, west, the four directions, but it makes me think of the Savior and how he gives us direction. Here we have more Native American tribes, and it's interesting how the woman has that flower pattern around her chest, and it reminds me of what we've seen with the Sami people and those Nordic tribes. Also pay attention to the fringe on the men. They have the fringe at the bottom of their outfits, and we also see fringe on the clothing of other tribes all over the world, including the Sami people. Also, this man on the very end in the red, he has that circular pendant around his neck. We're going to talk about that as we're going to see that as well amongst other indigenous tribes all over the world. You've got the girdles, you've got the beads, you've got the headdress with the feathers. There are so many similarities. Now, a lot of these tribes are from the northern parts of North America up into Canada. Here is a photo of a man from these northern tribes, and it says that this particular tribe of Native Americans referred to themselves as the Anishinaabe. It's a term that means the original man or the first man. So these natives believed that they were the original people on this land, going back thousands of years. Now, it's interesting, if you look at what this man is wearing, again, there's that piece of fabric going around his neck. There's the scarf also hanging down. You've got the feathers. You've got the floral pattern on that piece of fabric going around his neck. There are just so many similarities. Here are some members of the Kohari tribe of North Carolina, and as I was looking at this girl in the center, I couldn't help again but notice the similarities to the dresses and the clothing in the movie Frozen, especially with the colors. Again, noticing the headdress and those circles that they're wearing around their necks. I believe those are called gorgets, and they symbolize a level of status within your tribe. Here is an indigenous woman of Siberia, and again, you've got the braids, the headdress, and the beads extending past her hair and the robe. Here is an indigenous woman of northeastern Asia. She kind of looks like Reese Witherspoon. She's got the blonde braids, and if you look at what she's wearing on her head, you'll see a design that reminds me of the totem animals of the tribes in North America and Canada. Again, here is a Native American woman. Notice the gorget around her neck. Notice her shoes. They look very similar to Sami shoes. Again, you have the beads, you have the fringe, you have the scarf around the neck with the tassels and the robe. Here it is again on another Native American woman. And here it is on a Sami woman. And if you look at the bottom of her gorget, it reminds me of like a dream catcher. You see those, what look like feathers hanging from it. Just so similar to Native American traditions. Here are different Sami women from different Sami tribes, as well as a Native American woman, and they're wearing those gorgets around their necks. It's interesting that the Native American woman has what we would call a swastika around her neck, but this was well before the time of World War II, so it had a different meaning. Here is a depiction of this symbol in other cultures throughout the world. Traditionally, this symbol represents the revolving sun, infinity, or continuing creation. Here are members of the Micmac tribe of North America, and again, they resemble the clothing of the Sami. Look at his outfit, look at her dress, and especially her hat. Here again is a woman from the Iroquois tribe, and I love that her gorget has a heart on it. Here's a Native American woman with her bow and arrows. Her bow is down on the ground, and she's got the feather, she's got the fringe, she's got the beads. Here is a Native American family here in North America, and you can see they're very fair-skinned. They have blonde hair. This is very interesting, but again, you still have the fringe, you have the Native American dress, you've got the feathers, you've got the women with the long braids, and the design that you see on the boys' pants almost looks Scandinavian. Here is some traditional clothing of the Sami women of Norway and Finland. You've got the headdress, the gorget, and the tassels or fringe. Here's a woman from another Sami tribe. Again, you have the gorget, and you have that headdress that looks very similar to what we've seen in the Native American tribes. Here is another Sami woman from another Sami tribe. She's got what looks like 3 gorgets. She's got the tassels or the fringe. Again, just so many similarities. And here is a Native American woman from what I believe is the Ute tribe. And again, you look, she's got the gorgets, she's got the feathers, and she's wearing those bright colors, that bright red, just like the Sami. Here again is some of that bright red on a Sami girl. Again, there's the gorgets, and there are those tassels or fringe. And here is that Sami girl side by side with a Native American woman, and just the shape of their hats, just the top part, how it's kind of leveled off, it's sort of square on top, just very similar as with the fringe. And again, here is another Sami girl side by side with 2 Native American girls. And you look at the bottom of their dress and they just have this ruffle. They have this pattern or design around the hem of the bottom of their dress. They've got the belt or the girdle. They've got the gorgets, they've got the feathers, just so many similarities, the fringe, the tassels. I could just feel this connection between these different indigenous tribes, the people of the north and the people here on the North American continent, as well as other indigenous tribes all over the world. Here is another young woman from an indigenous northeastern Asian tribe. Again, you've got the beads, you've got the braids, you've got the patterns and designs on the dress. Just so many similarities. Here again, some more clothing styles from women of these northern indigenous tribes of Scandinavia. These particular outfits reminded me of South America, especially the colors around the hem of the dress, as well as the beaded designs around the girdles. Here is some traditional clothing of the indigenous women of Peru. Look at all the bright colors. Look at the hat that she's wearing. You've got the pants underneath the dress. Again, so many similarities. Here's an image of a woman in traditional Irish dress. Look at the tassels and the fringe and the various rainbow colors that she's wearing. Again, so much color. She's got the headdress on, and the clothing is always very modest. And here we have some indigenous German clothing side by side with the indigenous women of Peru. Look at the similarity of those dresses and colors. The pants underneath the skirt, so many similarities. And here we have some traditional German clothing. We have the fringe or the tassels. In some German traditional clothing, you will see a feather on the men's hats, but this particular man's hat has horsehair. Here we see some traditional Hungarian tribes, and this is interesting because he also has horsehair coming out of his hat. They have lots of animal hair on their clothing. They've got the beads, they've got the feathers. She's wearing the feathers on her headdress. It's like a mix of Bohemian and Native American. He's wearing an embroidered apron, and it appears that they are wearing ceremonial wedding clothing. And here we have a South African woman wearing traditional dress. If you look at the bottom of her dress, that reminds me of what we see the Native American women wearing. She's also got the beads around her neck. She's got the hat and the bright colors. And these indigenous tribes of Trinidad are wearing the red and the blue, just like the Sami people of the north. Here is a picture of the Sami flag, and the colors you'll notice are red, green, yellow, and blue. These are very symbolic, and these are the most common traditional colors used in Sami clothing. It has a circle on the flag that symbolizes the sun in red on one side and the moon in blue on the other side. The yellow and the green are symbols of nature and the animals. Here you have the indigenous people from Taiwan who are believed to be connected to the indigenous people of New Zealand. You see the beads around their neck, you see the headdress with the tassels hanging, and of course the bright colors. And here we have some traditional Scottish clothing, and this woman is wearing a gorget over her shawl. Also, she's wearing the red and the blue, just like the Sami. Now, the Scottish woman was wearing plaid, but here we have some indigenous women from India also wearing plaid robes. They've got the headdress and the beads around their neck. Here we have some more traditional Scottish clothing. Again, the bright red plaid. Now, the different patterns and colors of plaid are called tartans, and they represent the different tribes of Scotland. You could tell which clan a person was from based on the tartan they were wearing. It's very similar with the other indigenous tribes throughout the world, with the Sami and the Native Americans. Certain embroidered patterns and designs or woven fabric tell a story of your tribe. It's a way for people to differentiate which tribe you're from. The Maasai and petty tribes of Africa also wear plaid tartans, or what looks like kilts. Now, the word Maasai for the Maasai tribe reminds me of the word Messiah. So I looked up the meaning of Maasai, and it means my people. Now, here's an image of a woman wearing traditional Scottish clothing. This is a Scottish tartan. And if you look down below, you'll see this tassel hanging all the way down her dress. She has the braids and she's got the covering over her head, and then she also has the gorget. So I looked up the symbolism behind the tassels, and I have this here, this image. It says, in the Hebrew Bible, the Lord spoke to Moses, instructing him to tell the Israelites to make tassels on the corners of their garments to help them to remember all the commandments of the Lord and to keep them. So this is a sign of holiness. Well, this had me thinking of the tassels on a graduation cap. And I looked this up. It says generally here, it states that tassels are worn on the right side of the cap before the ceremony and are then moved to the left side to indicate that the wearer has passed from one level of learning to another, like a diploma at high school or an undergraduate degree. So this word for tassel, known as tzitzit, shares the root with the Hebrew word for lock of hair or dreadlock. For example, in the book of Ezekiel, an angel grabs the prophet by the tzitzit of his head. He could be said to be dragged by his hair. Now, these tassels are usually attached to the corners of the prayer shawl, and it was interesting to see all of these indigenous women and some men wearing these shawls that had the tassels or the fringe. This lock of hair could make sense of why we see the traditional German and Hungarian men having a lock of horsehair coming out of their hat. Now, Orthodox Jewish women were generally not permitted to wear these tassels, or at least if they chose to wear them, they were supposed to do it discreetly and wear them under their clothing. And it's interesting how we saw the traditional Scottish women's clothing. There was a tassel poking out from underneath her dress, underneath her clothing. And here we see the indigenous Incas of Peru, and you'll see that the men are wearing feathers. They have the hats with the tassels coming down over their ears. It reminds me of Orthodox Jews, which also reminds me of indigenous women who wear braids. There's a braid on each side by their ears. These men also have the fringe or the tassels hanging off of their clothing or shawls. Here we have Pueblo natives in traditional clothing. We see the shawls, the gorgets, the tassels hanging down the sides of the head, coming out of the hat, the apron, and the fringe. Just so many similarities. Here is a photo of some members of the Ute tribe from Colorado, and there's that pay attention number I always see, 311 or 113, reminds me of 3 Nephi chapter 11, and I thought it was interesting that in this photo they're wearing plaid. You have the plaid shawls, the plaid dress, so this is all very interesting, and I want to now take this and point it back to the people of the North and how this relates. Now in this photo, on the end, you'll see these 2 cute little babies. They're bundled up in these little carriers known as a papoose. Now here is a photo of something similar in Sami culture. They also have a baby board, and it goes by different names in different Sami tribes, such as Gietka, Klotkam, Kietkam, and Gietkam. The benefits of the cradle boards are that they can be sat straight up. You can lean them against a tree or a rock and the baby can sit upright. You can also hang them on a branch so the baby can swing and rock to sleep while you do chores and work. They could easily be attached to a horse when going on a long travel. The mothers also could wear them on their back like a backpack. And this is just one of the many similarities between the Sami tribes of the North and the tribes of North America. Another similarity between these tribes are the sacred drums. Now in the Sami culture, the drums are very sacred and it's something that they keep in the family and pass down from generation to generation. There's usually a story painted and depicted on the head of the drum. Here are some images of some Sami drum heads. Now, it was important for every family to own a drum, and it was the shaman who would use the drum when the family needed help. And this is similar to Native American cultures, where they also had a shaman. Now, in the Sami culture, in their history, when the Sami tribes became Christianized, their drums were burned and destroyed. So today, there's not very many of these Sami drums. A lot of Sami people don't understand the origins of them. And for the most part, their history is still a mystery. I'm going to read the screenshot right here of an observation of the Sami drums. They draw first, towards the middle of the tabor, a transverse line, above which they place the gods whom they hold in their greatest veneration, as Thor with underlings and Seta, and they draw another line a little below the former, but which extends only half across the tabor. There, Jesus Christ with 2 or 3 apostles are to be seen. Above these lines are represented the sun, the moon, the stars, and the birds. But the situation of the sun is under these very lines, on which they place the animals, the bears, and the serpents. Now, there are many theories out there about the Sami drums. I'm going to read this one because I saw my pay attention number on it, 144. It says, a different hypothesis about the symbols on the Sami drums emerged in the 1980s. The man who introduced the star map hypothesis, Bo Sammerstrom, examined the position of the symbols on the drums with a central cross design, including 41 drums from the Southern Sami group. He concluded that both the zodiac circle and separate constellations have influenced the positioning of several of the figures of the southern type of Sami drums. And he interpreted these figures as zodiac constellations, specifically the ram, the virgin, and the archer. 3 of the symbols he interpreted as separate constellations, the Milky Way, Pegasus, and Orion. These occurred frequently. He noticed he saw these patterns on most of the drum heads. And here is an example of the pattern he is referencing. Across just about all indigenous peoples and cultures over the centuries, the one thing they have in common are the drums. The drums are very important and very sacred. They are used to send prayers up to heaven, they're used for healing the sick, and they're used to commune with ancestors. In Native American culture, they are known to be the heartbeat of the people, and they believe that it connects them to the heartbeat of Mother Earth. Another similarity between the Sami people of the North and the North American native tribes are the teepees. This photo right here is a photo of a Sami teepee. It's called a lavu, and just like with Native Americans, it was used when traveling or camping. This next similarity is my favorite. Okay, so the Sami people have a type of singing, it's traditional singing, and it's called a yoik. And it's traditionally chanted in a cappella, and it's usually dedicated to a human being, an animal, or a landscape. And in northern Sami areas, the yoiks are personal. It's tied to a specific person. Usually a yoik is made for a person at the time that they are born. So everyone has their own unique song or yoik. When the Sami people were Christianized, it was believed that yoiking was evil, so they were forbidden to do it, and it was never written down, so a lot of these old historic yoiks have been lost. Right when I said that, it was 44 minutes and 41 seconds into this video. Now I'm going to show you a sample in just a minute, but when I first heard about yoiking, it reminded me of yodeling. In fact, the two words sound similar. So I looked into it, and sure enough, in Norway and Finland, the word yoiking is related to yodeling. The yoik in northern Sami, which is related to the yodel, is the monotone guttural singing of the Sami. As I listened to it, I began to hear the similarities in other cultures all over the world. In fact, I'll show you some clips right now of all the similarities that I noticed before I continued to look into it further.
We keep the rhythm of Mother Earth, her heartbeat with our hand on our heart.
Well, then I came across this. In Scandinavian folk music, the oral song tradition called kuling, also called huving, is a form of signal song, a shout to make themselves known over a long distance, especially used in the mountains. So, of course, it makes me think of yodelers. They're always yodeling in the mountains at the top of these peaks. Usually it's linked to the transhumance tradition. The cry could be individually designed so that it was not just a cry for contact, but also to be able to tell who they were. The cry may have a form of text, but is just as well without words. Characteristically, big melody scope and exchange between breast and falsetto voice. Lolling is related to yodeling in Switzerland and Austria. This was a way to communicate with people over long distances. And the Wikipedia points out all of the similarities across so many cultures. Persian classical music is very similar to Swiss yodeling, and it's also found in Bulgarian, Macedonian, Turkish, Armenian, Afghan, and Central Asian music traditions. And it says here that this type of yodeling music can also be found among the Siberian, the Inuit of the Arctic regions of Greenland, and the Sami of Scandinavia, also among the Irish and Scottish people. You'll even find yodeling in Africa, in Central Africa among the Pygmy, as well as the Shawnee people of Zimbabwe. If you look for it, you'll find it among indigenous tribes all over the world. And in Romania, yodeling is used by shepherds to call to their sheep as a way of expressing sorrow. Many Hawaiian songs feature falsetto and something that sort of sounds like yodeling. Sometimes the singer exaggerates the breakthrough repetition as a yodel. And as with other aspects of Hawaiian music, falsetto developed from a combination of sources including pre-European Hawaiian chanting, early Christian hymn singing, and the songs of yodeling from the immigrant cowboys. And how did yodeling become popular among cowboys? Well, it's believed that yodeling was first introduced to the United States by German immigrants in Pennsylvania in the early 1800s. And as the new settlers traveled south through the Appalachian Mountains and beyond into the Deep South, they came into contact with the Scots and the Irish immigrants, Scandinavians. These were all practitioners of a unique yodeling called kulning, and other nationalities, including African slaves who communicated in the fields with a long, loud musical shout, rising and falling and breaking into falsetto. Most experts agree that yodeling was used in the Central Alps by herders calling their stock or to communicate between alpine villages. And speaking of cowboys, American cowboys, the earliest record of a yodel is in 1545, where it is described as the call of a cowherd from Appenzell. I will have a link to this amazing story right here down below in the video description. This is a man who is popular on YouTube because he made his debut on Sweden's Got Talent. He is a member of a Sami tribe. His name is Jon Henrik. And what's so amazing about him is that he was actually adopted from Colombia by a Swedish family, and he's been adopted into their Sami tribe. And he's from Colombia, but he is able to do this amazing yoking, which could be in his DNA if his heritage comes from the indigenous tribes of Colombia. Here are some clips of their traditional music. And while looking up Colombian traditional and indigenous music, this video popped up. There was my pay attention number again, 144, the gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. And here it is again on this video of a song by Colombian singer Shakira. And I have to say, she definitely has that ability to jump up and down into that falsetto. And those pay attention numbers were all over this screenshot of this Native American peace song, Yahweh, Yahweh. That sort of sounds like Yahweh, or the Hebrew word for God. Now back to the Sami tribes of the north. Here's a screenshot I found on a blog. I just want to share it with you real quick. This person wrote, "We also have the stories about the northern lights, of course, and also, as in the rest of the northern hemisphere, there is a legend about the female reindeer with great antlers that flies over the sky from the darkness of the new year and brings light and life into the new year." Winter solstice is a big part of Sami tradition and culture. Now, if you've seen my Christmas video that I did a few months ago, it talks all about this. Well, I came across something called Jewish Winter Solstice Tales, and it references various accounts in the Old Testament and how that relates to winter solstice. It talks about Adam experiencing winter solstice for the first time. It talks about Leviathan and how winter solstice was used to create order out of chaos. Now here's where I find even more incredible similarities between ancient Israel and the Sami people. So there's a Hebrew word called tekufat. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And it literally means turn or cycle. And it represents the 4 seasons of the year that are recognized by the Talmud. And this probably will sound familiar. The first is called Nisan. The second is Tammuz. The third is Teshri. And the fourth is Tevet. In other words, the winter solstice, when the sun enters Capricornus, this being the beginning of winter, when the night is the longest during the year. Now, the holy days on the Jewish calendar revolve around the sighting of a new moon. That is what they use as their calendar. The sighting of the new moon determines the new month. And anciently, there was something called a signal fire. And as ancient as it sounds, it was one of the best methods used to send out important messages through great distances in a short time period. So there were stacks of wood that were ready to go on top of specific mountaintops with watchers who awaited a signal to light their fire, creating a chain reaction, taking the signal from one corner of a country to the other. And just as the new moon is important to the Jews in helping determine the times and the seasons, for the Sami people, they have something similar, but it's for spotting the sun. So in Scandinavia, during the winter months, the sun would disappear for many days. After 35 days, scouts would be sent to the mountaintops to look for the return of the sun. Now, I like that. I'm going to read that again. You can just hear the symbolism in that. The scouts would return to the mountaintops to look for the return of the sun. I just have to say, mountains always symbolize temples, and I love to think that they were going to the temple to look for the return of the sun. When the first light was seen, the scouts would return with the good news. A great festival would be held called Yuletide, and a special feast would be served around a burning fire with the Yule log. Great bonfires would also be lit to celebrate the return of the sun. They believed that at this time of Yule, their god, Odin, would lead a great hunting party through the sky in celebration, and the Sami goddess of the sun would ride in a sled enclosed by reindeer antlers in her journey across the sky. And as we've talked about before in past videos, especially in the Christmas video, that there is a connection to Odin and God the Father, as well as Odin and Father Christmas. Hence the flying sled and reindeer. Now we all know that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole where his workshop is headquartered, and all year long his crew of elves work hard to produce gifts that Santa brings to all the children who make it on the nice list. Well, according to Norse mythology, Odin also had a crew of industrious elves known as Odin's men, who made small gifts for Odin to deliver. The manufacturing, of course, didn't take place at the North Pole, but many parts of Scandinavia are situated above the Arctic Circle. Odin himself was said to live in a frozen world to the north called Asgard, where he often clashed with icy giants. And as this Sami person wrote in this article, she said, "Before Christianity, the Sami people did have their beliefs, their gods and holy places that they visited. And the sun is one of our most beloved and important gods, our Father. The Sami people are sons and daughters of Mother Earth and Father Sun." These beliefs are very similar to many indigenous tribes all over the world. Now, unfortunately, the Sami people have lost a lot of their history and tradition, and they don't quite understand the reasoning behind a lot of their beliefs or customs. And there's also a lot that has been lost and forgotten. So a lot of it's a mystery and based on theory. Now here's an article I found about Hanukkah, and there's some things that stood out to me here. So I'm going to read it. It just says, "The ritual of candle lighting on Hanukkah seems to originally have marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Candle lighting is not mentioned as part of the Hanukkah observances in the days of the Maccabees themselves, and the connection between Hanukkah and kindling is first documented over 100 years after the Hasmonean victory. But there is a reason to believe that this element was added to the Hanukkah celebration in the days of King Herod, shortly after Julius Caesar introduced the Julian solar calendar throughout the Roman Empire in 46 BC. In the wake of the adoption of this calendar, many people began celebrating the winter solstice as the birthday of the sun, since it marks the beginning of the period in which the daylight hours begin to lengthen. So they were already celebrating the birth of the sun at the time that we celebrate Christmas. Now, of course, this is why we celebrate the birth of Christ around the time of winter solstice, was to align with these beliefs. However, it is very symbolic because when Christ was born, he brought the light into a dark world. Just like the first sighting of the sun brings that light back into a dark world. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we celebrate the birth of Christ 3 days after the darkest day of the year. And to me, that 3-day period is very symbolic. When Christ was crucified and he left this earth, there was darkness for 3 days, and upon his resurrection, that light returned. Based on the account in 3rd Nephi chapter 11, you can see the symbolism and how this parallels. In fact, a Talmudic legend credits Adam to this 8-day observance of 8 lights, celebrating the end of winter solstice and the sun returning to the earth. And we see this celebration and observance of the winter solstice and the ending of the winter solstice all over the world through many indigenous tribes and in ancient cultures. Now, the Cahokia indigenous people were one of these people. They built numerous temple pyramids or mounds similar to the structures built by the Aztecs in Mexico over 1,000 years ago. And among their constructions, what most stands out is an intriguing structure made up of wooden posts arranged in a circle known today as Woodhenge. And to understand the purpose of Woodhenge, scientists watch the sunrise from this structure on winter solstice. And what they found was telling. The sun aligned with both Woodhenge and the top of a temple mound, a temple built on top of a pyramid with a flat top in the distance. They also found that the sun aligns with a different temple mound on summer solstice. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people of Cahokia venerated the sun as a deity. Scholars believe that ancient indigenous societies observed the solar system carefully and wove that knowledge into their architecture. Another example is the Persian festival Yalda, or Shab-e-Yalda. It's a celebration of the winter solstice in Iran that started in ancient times, and it marks the last day of the Persian month of Azar. Yalda is viewed traditionally as the victory of light over dark, and the birthday of the sun god Mithra. Families celebrate together with special foods like nuts and pomegranates, and some stay awake all night to welcome the sun in the morning. And here's another example in Peru. This is called Inti Raymi. This solstice celebration comes in June rather than December, but for Peru, it is a winter solstice. And this Incan celebration is in honor of the sun god. Originally celebrated by the Inca before the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, the festivities included feasts and sacrifices. And in China, they have what's called Dongzhi. This is the arrival of winter, and it's an important festival in China. It's a time for family to get together and celebrate the year that they have had. Based on the traditional Chinese celestial calendar, the holiday generally falls between the 21st and 23rd of December. Now, I don't think that's a coincidence. It's thought to have started as an end-of-harvest festival, with workers returning from the fields and enjoying the fruits of their labors with family. And I love that pay attention number 311 showed up on this screenshot. Now, as with just about all indigenous tribes, the spiritual practices of the Sami caused a lot of fear and concern among the European nations. The Norse sagas mention the Sami as giants and dangerous sorcerers. Now, I kind of laugh at this because this reminds me of what I've talked about before in past videos about what the Romans did when they wanted to conquer a people. It makes me think of the Germanic tribes and the Celts. They stood in the way of these big empires wanting to conquer. And so they obviously felt threatened by them, and they wanted to come in and civilize them and Christianize them. But in order to go in and take over, they had to paint these people as a threat. They had to paint them as dangerous, barbaric, savages, which of course was never the truth. Now, usually when there's something you don't understand, you fear it because you don't understand it. And that's what happened here, just like all the other times throughout history. The Sami people were known to be the most peaceful people then and still to this day. As it was with a lot of native tribes, when people encountered them for the first time, they were often peaceful and wanted to help. Those are the fruits of a people of God when they are peaceful and kind and live in harmony. That was the history of the Sami. They were not a warlike people. Over time, their practices, beliefs, and customs sort of got lost, especially when they began to assimilate with all of modern society that kept encroaching in on their borders. And so we see this happening all over the world throughout history, and I believe this is what happened to them. Over time, those traditions and customs sort of lost their meaning, got misinterpreted, got twisted around, to the point, as we see today, where it's completely lost all meaning and they don't understand or have much of a knowledge of their own history and their past, especially their religious beliefs. So it's all been left to interpretation by people today. I talked about this in a recent video a few months ago, how it was similar to the Druids, and it was believed that the Druids were actually Levitical priests in exile. Because they were working through that priesthood power of God, they were manifesting miracles. People were afraid of that, and they thought that they were wizards or sorcerers of magic. And as I've shared before, back then, people that believed in true Christianity, that God the Father, His Son, and the Holy Ghost were three separate beings, they were called pagan worshipers, because they were accused of believing in multiple gods. Instead of all three being in one body, like the Trinity, they believed that God the Father, His Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost were three separate beings. Therefore, they were deemed and labeled as polytheists, believing in multiple gods, and they were considered pagans, and they were persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church. And because of that knowledge, I am extra careful when I'm reading through history and I see that a certain group of people was labeled as pagans. I'm very careful at examining that. Well, European cities feared pestilences carried on the wind that may be sent by the Sami shamans. As larger nations began to settle in those areas, they began to lay claim on the Sami land, and they began to target the Sami people into converting over to their ways. This is a past that they share with indigenous people all over the world. Now, another thing that the Sami people have in common, especially with the Native Americans, is the lasso. Now, the lasso was invented by Native Americans who used it effectively in war against Spanish invaders. It was also used to herd cattle. But lassos aren't just a part of North American culture. There is evidence of lassos being used in Egypt. There's a depiction from 1280 BC showing the pharaoh holding a lasso and then holding onto a bull roped around the horns. The Huns are recorded as using lassos in battle to ensnare opponents prepared to defend themselves in hand-to-hand combat around 370 AD. And lassos were also used by the Tatars and are still used by the Sami people and the Finns in reindeer herding. In Mongolia, a variant of the lasso called an urga is used, consisting of a rope loop at the end of a long pole. Lassos are also mentioned in the Greek histories of Herodotus in the 7th book. It speaks of this wandering tribe known by the name of Sagartians, a people of Persian language. And finally, this connection. These are Sami shoes, and if you've ever paid close attention, you've probably noticed that they point up at the tips, just like the elf shoes in this photo. Have you ever wondered what the background story is behind these pointed shoes of the people of the North? Well, they're not just an interesting fashion statement. Believe it or not, they serve a purpose. Yes, just like in this photo, they are designed to hold on to the skis. So the Sami people can clip the toe of their shoe into this little hook on the skis, and they are safely fastened in. So they can walk when they need to and ski when they need to. Yes, the Sami people are credited as the first people to invent the ski. Now, the native tribes of Alaska, who also live up near the Arctic, they have a means of transportation in the snow. No, it's not downhill skiing, it's the snowshoe. And when not on their feet, their other mode of transportation has been dog sledding. As you can see here in this image, there's the sled. It's a one-person sled with a dog pulling the load. Now, with the Sami people, they have been known to also use sled dogs, but they are more notorious for using reindeer as their animal of choice in pulling their sleds. And just like the sled in the image before, this is a narrow one-person sled. And here are the natives of Alaska also using reindeer to pull their sled. But this didn't happen until after 1892, when Sami people were brought in to teach the native Alaskans all about reindeer, as reindeer had also been brought in and introduced to Alaska. With all these similarities, one might ask, well, is this just a coincidence? So now we're going to talk about that. Let's explore how these indigenous groups of people probably crossed paths in the past, and are they related through DNA? My theory has always been that different groups have used the Bering Strait as sort of a bridge between the Arctic Circle and North America, that many times people have probably gone back and forth, meaning groups from the northern countries may have migrated down through the Bering Strait into North America, and centuries later, people living in North America may have decided to migrate north towards the Arctic Circle. This would explain all of the similarities and also explain why many of them might be cousins, distantly related. There are some interesting theories about the Bering Land Bridge completely freezing over at times, and there is compelling evidence and research among creationists that can fit everything that has happened in the world within the last 6,000 years, according to the timeline of the Bible. That these things didn't happen millions of years ago, and that they didn't take millions of years to happen. And I will have some links down below if you want to check that out, but it is very fascinating. So this theory suggests that the Ice Age happened after the flood. It also explains how the ice was formed, and it makes sense that this would have been a period of time when many people could have easily have crossed back and forth across that frozen bridge. So, in the book of 2nd Esdras, it speaks of the lost tribes traveling to a northern location where never mankind dwelt. And in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Ether, it talks about Jared's people traveling through a wilderness where there never had man been. The prophet Jeremiah also describes Israelites traveling through the wilderness in a land where no man dwelt. So it appears these people of the north migrated west to the North American continent. Here's a news article that stood out to me. It says, Siberians beaten by Iberians as the first to settle in America. Now here is a map of Iberia, and you can see it's where Spain and Portugal are today. As I began to read about this edge of Eurasia, I saw my pay attention number 144, the 144,000, the 12 tribes of Israel. This is another reminder of those lost tribes being gathered in. And then I came across more evidence to support my theory. This article says Native American DNA is found in Denmark and Iceland. Portions of the public and some ethnologists have fought hard in the last century to prove that native North American DNA never landed in Iceland and probably not in Greenland. However, these claims have been disproved by archaeologists who have uncovered the exact DNA that the detractors tried to deny. And one researcher was quoted as saying, I think the people of the North in the Eastern Hemisphere must be the originals. Not of all humankind, perhaps, but of Northern Europe and Asia, from where they migrated to have commanded the Arctic Circle. Interestingly, most people of the North and Native American nations use names for their own tribes that actually mean the people, or the first people, or the real people, etc. The Korean term Han translates as the people, but with an additional sense of shading to suggest the first and only people. The people of the North in the Eastern Hemisphere number at least 41 separate nations or tribes. These nations migrated in order to find additional sources of food and habitation. And just as other First Nations around the world have done over millennia, as recorded in history for about 6,000 years, the difference is that they began their migrations along the Arctic Circle and seemed not to have ventured southward until they reached Alaska. From Alaska, they fanned out in separate groups and finally reached the tip of South America, migrated back up into the Ohio Valley, and met the Europeans that drove them back. One exception was the Mohawk Nation and other Iroquois, who assimilated large numbers of themselves into European American society and became successful in business. The people of the North that became Canada's First Nations seem to have journeyed all the way to the East Coast and then further to Greenland and finally to Iceland, where they intermarried with the Northern Europeans and Scandinavians. The Sami of Norway are ancestors of some Native Americans, and they may have migrated northeast and west. Now, there are 3 affiliated tribes who claim to be the original people of the land. So these tribes are known as the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Sahnish. These tribes believe that their presence in North America is from the beginning of time. And the Mandan call themselves the people of the first man. And the Hidatsa were known as the Minatari. Now that word Minatari is spelled in different ways, but it means to cross the water. So these were a group of people who most likely arrived next after having crossed a great water. Now the Shawneesh people say that their name was chosen as it was used among themselves because it means the original people from whom all other tribes sprang. Now this tribe lived in North Dakota, and I found some similarities to the Sami people. This tribe, the Sahnish, relied a lot on dogs, and every typical family owned at least 30 to 40 dogs. They would also use these dogs not just for hunting, but for transportation, in which they would haul loads on something sort of like a sled that they would drag along the ground. They also have a creation myth in which they speak of a great sky chief named Nishanu. There's that word Anu, which usually means God. And this god created giants. And it says the giants did not respect Nishanu, who had created them, and most of the giants were destroyed by a great flood. the good giants who were saved became corn kernels under the earth. So it talks about how some of these giants who were good were spared, but they had to go down beneath the earth. And it's said that this story is used to reflect the migrations of this tribe from east to west. And now I came across another native tribe known as the Samish, which to me sounds like Sami. It has the word Sami, S-A-M-I, in the word. And there was my pay attention number 144. So according to this website, it said that they found bison bones that had been serrated that carbon dated back to 14,400 years ago. Now, I don't agree with carbon dating. I feel like it's very flawed. I know that a lot of creationist scientists will talk about this. But anyways, what stood out to me is that the Samish tribe lived in the northwest of North America. So they lived on the islands off the coast of Washington and up into Alaska. So to me, there are a lot of similarities, not only with the name, but with the region. Their ancestors very well could be the people of the North. In fact, I came across a YouTube video that spoke of a legend from this tribe. They don't treat it as a legend. They believe it to be part of their actual ancestry. It's interesting. It's about a woman in their tribe. They have her name, they have her lineage and genealogy, and they talk about how one day a man came out of the sea and said that he was sort of the king of the sea. He commanded all the creatures of the sea, and they fell in love and wanted to get married, but her parents wouldn't allow it because he wanted her to go live beneath the water with him, and they didn't even think that was possible for her to survive underwater and didn't think it was right. So he said he would curse them if they didn't allow her to marry him. And sure enough, the very next day when they went out fishing, they couldn't catch any fish, and they weren't able to find food. The water all began to dry up. So she went to her parents and begged them to let her marry him because she loved him and she wanted to save her people. So they finally allowed it, and there was a ceremony. He married her, and he made a way for her to be able to survive underwater in his world. And the agreement was that every year she would come back and visit her people. And apparently over time, when she'd come back, her countenance started to change, and she began to look different. She began to have scales all over her body and little barnacles growing on her and seaweed in her hair. And they said that it was very awkward because she stopped looking like her people. She became very sad, and so over time they have established these traditions where once a year they go out to the water to remember her and give her that attention, and they bring food and they think of her in hopes that that will heal that relationship. It almost sounds like this is where the legends of mermaids may come from. But aside from that, what stood out to me the most was the people in this video. Look at what they are wearing. The red with the blue. They are wearing the Sami people colors, the people of the North. Let's continue exploring the origins of these Native American tribes. What is certain is that the ancestral nation tribes of today's Native American nations live completely around the Arctic Circle. This is borne out by DNA evidence that also shows shared DNA between Iroquois, example given the Mohawk, and Zulu nations, which also in some locales share the same word for cousin. Another certainty is that Native Americans and Asians, such as the Japanese, metabolize alcohol similarly to one another, but differently from Europeans. This is a further genetic link. Foundation stories and myths are similar all around the Arctic Circle. For example, the reindeer that pulls the sun up in the east in Scandinavia and Siberia becomes a dragon in Korea. And once again, a reindeer, elk, or bison in North America. The turtle is prominent in helping to form the earth in both some Asian as some Native American histories. Now, I've talked a little bit about the turtle and Native American legends in past videos, but here's something I wanted to share. Here is an image of the turtle legend. As you can see, the entire shape of the North American continent appears to be the shape of this sea turtle. Now, what's interesting about this is this legend of this turtle island, this sea turtle, has been around long before we've had accurate maps of the North American continent. So the legend goes that God was ready for that sixth day of creation to create the beasts on the land and mankind. However, there was a problem. There was nowhere to put mankind or these land beasts because they would drown in the water and they couldn't fly like the birds above. So the animals in the water got together and came up with a plan, and they started to dig earth up and put it on top of this giant sea turtle until there was enough earth on this floating turtle to create an island that would be the perfect place for Mother Earth to give birth to her creations. The turtle's also shared the legend of the turtle tribe, and I will have the waters to that video down below. America. But there are other legends about turtles being sacred in Native American traditions, and also there's a legend of people traveling across the great waters on the backs of turtle shells, which sounds an awful lot like the Jaredites in the Book of Mormon, and the way that they traveled from the old world to the new world. Now, in Hindu and Chinese culture, there's something that is spoken of today as the space turtle theory, something to do with the earth being on the back of a turtle shell, and something to do with being up in the skies or in the cosmos. And so people have interpreted that as, oh, this means that the turtle flew down from space and became the earth. However, common sense and listening to and talking to Native North Americans, here's what you'll learn. To the Cree, it was called Mykenna, or Capella to the ancient Greeks, and it is the turtle star. The Mykenna is the brightest star in a group of stars that make up a rough oval shape, like the shell of a turtle. The Greeks called this constellation Auriga, and it was used as a lunar calendar. And a friend of mine recently shared this post with me. It says, the turtle shell has 13 internal nodes and 28 external nodes, making it a perfect lunar calendar, with 28 moon cycles known as months and 13 months completing a year. This was a system of the keeping used by the Native Americans and multiple ancient peoples dating back to the Book of Enoch. Absolutely none of these highly educated people believe that they lived on the back of a space turtle. That ridiculous notion was introduced no more than 50 years ago by a globe theorist who had to lie in order to mock an Earth model and lunar calendar. They could not comprehend. The turtle shell lunar calendar is ancient, and the propaganda campaign against it is filled with lies and ignorance, in promotion of the solar calendar and only 12 zodiac signs. And I came across this right here. It says, the Shawnee creation myth is similar to other Algonquin creation myths in maintaining that the people who are now the Shawnees originated from a different world, an island balanced on the back of a giant turtle, and traveled to this one. According to the Shawnee myth, when the first people were on the island, they could see nothing but water, which they did not know how to cross. They prayed for aid and were miraculously transported across the water. The Shawnees are the only Algonquin tribe whose creation story includes the passage of their ancestors over the sea, and for many years they held an annual sacrifice in thanks of the safe arrival of their ancestors to this country. Another branch of tribe known as the Pequot, whose name means a man coming out of the ashes, tells of an ancient fire that after burning out yielded a great puffing and blowing from which a man rose from the ashes. This has signified the perfect man of the Great Spirit's creation. Now what's interesting is this tribe is one of the 4 breakoffs of the Shawnee, who were considered to be one of the most important Algonquin tribes. Now, they were known to be a tribe that had the hereditary priesthood. That is what they believed, and that is what they taught. So the Pequot belonged to the Shawnee, and the Shawnee are believed by scholars today to have descended from the Hopewell Nation. And the Hopewell people, by Latter-day Saint scholars, are believed to be the Nephite people in the Book of Mormon who left Jerusalem around 600 BC and then came to North America. Linguistics is another tracker of relatedness amongst these tribes and peoples, and we find similarities in various language elements among the various related people. In the Cherokee language, the word for rabbit is jistu. Now that word kind of reminds me of Yesu or Jesus or Jesus. And the reason this is interesting is because I shared in a recent video called 2023, the Year of the Rabbit, how I came across a page in an old book about Native American history, and I can't remember the particular tribe, but I'll have a link to that video down below, and they talked about in their tradition that once there was this man who came down from heaven, and he was full of light. He visited their people, and he healed their sick and taught them his gospel. And then he ascended back up into heaven, but he told them he would again return someday, and he gave them the signs to look for upon his return. In Chinese culture, it is the Year of the Rabbit. 2023 is the Year of the Rabbit. And I had a friend reach out to me the other day, and she said, it's so interesting because the tortoise and the hare, or, the turtle and the rabbit, is a story that keeps coming up for me. It just keeps popping up. I keep hearing about turtles and rabbits. She said, do you know what this connection might mean, or has this been happening to you as well? Well, now I can say yes. Now back to this article about linguistics and commonalities. It says, notice the similarities in the accompanying pictures of different cultures. An additional link is the fact that an Iroquois word for cousin was found to appear in a Zulu language dialect as well, with the same meaning in the mid-1990s. Now here is a picture of a Zulu chief. Notice the detail. And then let's move on to this picture right here of a member of the Mohawk Nation. Both nations also often use a ball of short feathers with 1 to 3 long feathers sticking straight up out of it at the crown of the head. And here's another connection. So this talks about the different names for the different Sami people. The Sioki are the sea Sami, so the Sami people of the sea, and this is the Swedish name for them. And now it is pronounced exactly as the branch of the creeks in northeast Georgia, known as the Soki, spelled a couple of different ways, and the tribe in northwest South Carolina, known as the Joki or Jokasi, and the co-founders of the so-called Olmec civilization in southern Mexico, known as the Soki or Zoki. It says, I am showing this to readers so the Native Americans will understand that when I say people from Scandinavia are the root stock for the Creek people, I do not mean people who look like Britney Spears. Black-haired, bronze-skinned peoples from the northwest Iberia and southwest Ireland came at about the same time. Native Americans from Peru and southern Mexico later settled among the Yuchi and intermarried with them. These pioneers in southeastern North America were Uralic, like the Finns, modern Sami, and Karelians. They were not Asians from eastern Siberia. I might add that the Maya migration legend states that their ancestors also came from that part of the world. They followed the Atlantic coast of North America to reach the Yucatan. The earliest example of the Maya numbers and glyphs may be found in Nyköping, Sweden, on the Baltic Sea. They have been dated to 2000 BC. Now, those same ancient glyphs found in Sweden can also be found at Track Rock Gap in Georgia, here in the United States. It says this is very obvious evidence that cannot be ignored. So, if your family has a surprisingly high level of Sami, Finnish, Karelian, and pre-Celtic Irish DNA markers, they should be considered Native American. Below are paintings of the Yuchi around Savannah by German artist Jorg von Reck. Now look at these depictions of these natives from Georgia and compare it to these photos of these native Pueblo people. Notice the similar red aprons that both men are wearing. And here is a photo of a Sami woman. She is also wearing a red apron. Now, the Hopi people are part of these Pueblo people, and the Hopi people are believed to be the very first Native Americans or indigenous people on the North American continent. And the word Hopi means peaceful people. These people were very peaceful and known to be very religious and spiritual. Speaking of a peaceful and religious people, those who subscribe to the Heartland theory believe that the Hopewell people were the Nephite people in the Book of Mormon. The Hopewell culture is believed to have died off around 500 AD, and that's about a 100-year difference with the Nephite culture, which is believed to have died off around 385 AD, and Moroni buried the plates in about 421 AD. Now, the Algonquin and the Iroquois people are descendants of the Hopewell people. Here is a map of the population of the Iroquois tribes. Now compare that to the map of their cousins, the Algonquin tribes, and you can see quite the difference. The Algonquin tribes are said to be the most populous tribes in Canada and North America out of all the Native American tribes. Now, Squanto and his people were said to be of the Algonquin tribes, and they were a very peaceful and kind people, as demonstrated in the history of the Pilgrims. And Pocahontas, who was the bridge for establishing peace between the colonists and the Algonquin tribes. The Hopewell, who are believed to be the ancestors of the Iroquois and the Algonquin people, have some striking similarities between the setup of their villages and housing as compared to the Sami people of the north. Take a look at this Hopewell village surrounded by trees in the woods. Look at the shape and the construction of the housing. And compare that to this depiction right here of a Sami village. Look at the structure and shape of those houses or huts. Both seem to be built the same way. Both made of wood and covered with bark. And I found this interesting. Around 1400 BC, the elite of the Scandinavian Bronze Age civilization were burying their dead in tombs and earthworks almost identical to those later constructed by the Adena culture in southeastern United States and the Ohio Valley. And their bakeware pottery was identical to the indigenous people of Georgia. This adds another witness to the glyphs that were found in Georgia that are identical to ancient glyphs in Sweden. Now, I'll have a link to this article down below that links the Aboriginal people of eastern Scandinavia to the Atlantic coast of North America. So it's pretty interesting. Here's another screenshot I took from that article. It says around 750 BC, Proto-Finnish tribes sailed across the Baltic to settle Karelia and Finland, absorbing to varying degrees the descendants of earlier migrations into eastern Scandinavia. They carried with them the red-haired gene. Now, I talked about this in a video last year, all about the origins of red hair. So they carried with them this red-haired gene of the Parakas, or the egghead people of Ukraine. These were people that had cone-shaped heads. Blonde hair is equally common in Finland and Sweden. So they believe that prior to the arrival of this red-haired gene in Scandinavia, the people there would have had more bronze skin and dark hair. The Yuchi and Eastern Creek descendants in North America are showing a significant level of Sami and Finnish DNA markers. The immediate response would be, oh, that means that the Yuchi on the Savannah River arrived after Finns and Sami intermarried, or after 700 BC. However, I strongly suspect that the laboratories are picking up the DNA of Aboriginal peoples in the Baltic region, who later interbred with the new Finnish arrivals. I researched some Sami accounts from around the 1800s to the turn of the century, and they said that the people who lived closest to the sea, or the furthest up north, resembled more of the appearance of Native Americans. They had the dark hair and the brown skin, and the Sami people who lived closer inland looked more like the Finns and the Swedes. They had the lighter complexions and the lighter hair. This happened as they intermarried and interbred with the Scandinavian people. I reached out to an awesome creationalist geneticist who responded to my question about the origins of the Sami people and their haplogroups. Here's what he told me. He said, first of all, the Sami people acquired the Scandinavian haplogroup I1 simply because they are geographically living very close to the Scandinavian Indo-European people. Then he talks about Native American history, and he says, this is one of the wildest narratives that has arisen from the Y chromosome tree. And he provided me a YouTube link that explains it in detail. I really enjoyed that video, so I'm going to include it down below. But he said, in short, the current Native American lineage arose from Central Asia in close proximity to a likely homeland en route location of the Sami people. Though they belong to other lineages, such as haplogroups Q and C, these existed in close geographic proximity to the ancient homelands of haplogroups N and R1A. So in other words, Native Americans belong to different haplogroups than the Sami people, but these different haplogroups they belong to were in close geographic proximity to the haplogroups that the Sami people inherited. And he points out that there's likely even more to the Sami story than the current Y chromosome findings reveal. So he said as more Sami men have their Y chromosome lineages tested and do those DNA tests, the more rare ancient lineages will eventually emerge, which will help fill in the gaps to their history. So based on the current DNA studies, here are the findings so far on the Sami origins. They have 37% haplogroup I1 and 58% of haplogroup N and 5% haplogroup R1A, which is the Scandinavian people. Now he says the origins of haplogroup I1 come from Japheth, the son of Noah, and likely through Japheth's son, Javan. Both I1 and I2 arose from haplogroup I, which joined haplogroup J around the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Together, I and J look like they were part of the early Indo-European peoples, which today are as dispersed as Iceland and India, and the Americas, of course, due to the migrations of the last few centuries. Now, this is very interesting. He says around 800 to 500 BC, I1 and I2 haplogroups split. He says, I'm still trying to figure out what this history corresponds to. With the data that we currently possess, I1 has very few clues to its history. It's a flat line for about 2,000 years before it starts multiplying again within the last few hundred, around the same time that people around the globe underwent dramatic population expansion. Today, it's found primarily in Europe with a skew towards Scandinavia. So here's a map of where haplogroup I1 can be found today. And then he talks about haplogroup R1A. He said R1A rose from Shem via Shem's great-great-grandson, Yoktan, and via one of Yoktan's sons. He says, I don't know which one specifically. R1A and its relatives, R1B, R2, and Q, roamed Central Asia for most of human history and likely were part of the ancient Scythian people, among others. R1A broke away from R1B somewhere around the time of Christ. It may have resided in the Middle East for some time. He's still trying to figure that out. And then in the last few centuries, the R1A people multiplied and rapidly dispersed through parts of Europe, across Central Asia, and even down into India and the Middle East. Now this is interesting because Christ is a descendant of Noah's son Shem. It's believed that a lot of Christ's family members, his relatives, his friends, and his disciples migrated into Europe after his death and resurrection. And this is where Christianity began to flourish. And finally, haplogroups N and O were once believed to be one lineage. Both descended from Shem through Yoktan, or one of Yoktan's sons. Around the 2000s to 1600 BC, haplogroups O and N separated. He said that haplogroup O eventually became the dominant lineage in East and Southeast Asia, and one of the O sub-branches is his best candidate for the early Chinese Sino-Tibetan peoples. And haplogroup N is one of his best candidates for the long-standing groups north of China, including the Xianbei. He suspects that haplogroup N individuals were in the Mongolian Central Asia area until late in history when the Russians expanded west. And here is a map of where haplogroup N can be traced today. Now here's a question that I found posed online to ask Gramps. It says, could the Sami people of northern Norway be descended from one of the lost tribes of Israel? This person writes, Dear Gramps, I understand that some of the tribes of Israel that were lost went north. Over 30 years ago, I worked in the northmost part of Norway for several years. Once, when a friend of mine who was in the insurance business and I went to a Sami village, he asked me to go with him to see the midwife. There I was shown a book written by a Sami man who apparently had done some research on the origin of the Sami people. It was his opinion that they had traveled north from the Middle East, all the way up to northern Europe, where they met the forefathers of the Finnish people. He pointed out some important differences in appearance between the two tribes, and as far as I can remember, he had a theory that somehow the Israelites lost their own language and developed a new one very similar to Finnish. As years went by, they also lost their knowledge of their origin and ended up as the Samis. And because of the language and their new habitat, it was supposed that they and the Finns originated from the same people. He says he's never been able to have this man's theory confirmed. And of course, Gramps couldn't really confirm it either. So what was exciting about this to me is that was my theory as well, that these people of the north came from Israel. And the reason they are a lost tribe is because they lost their identity, they lost their culture, they lost their language, and they lost their history. Just as it was for all the other lost tribes who assimilated into other cultures and with other people. Well, I came across this interesting website right here that talks about the possible origins of the Sami people, which sounds very similar to this theory. I took the screenshot. I'll just read from it. It says, the Sami speak a language related to Finnish, so the people of Finland. The females have the same mitochondrial DNA as the women of the Berbers in North Africa. Similarities with the mtDNA of the Basques in Spain have also been claimed. The Y male DNA is similar in general to that of the Finns, though its details quite differentiated. Historically, the Lapps are not Finns and are quite different from them. In fact, an analysis of the similarities and differences of Y DNA between Sami and Finns could well be used to illustrate the effects of environment in determining DNA. Physically, the Sami, who they also call the Lapps, are of mixed white and Mongoloid type. Customs and namesakes among the Lapps may indicate ancient Persian and Israelite contacts. It's theorized that the ancestors of the Finnish people were few in number, and they came in contact with the Sami people and decided to mix in with them to preserve their people. And they ended up giving them characteristics that indicate Middle East ancestry. They themselves then lost these same characteristics, and the only remembrance we have of them is what the Sami people retained. The possibility of this suggestion would appear to be strengthened by a modern linguistic theory that virtually says the same and holds that the Finns of Finland received the Finnish language through contact with the Lapps or groups related to them. The author of this article goes on to say that Finland in biblical codes was linked to Joseph, and Suomi, the official Finnish name for Finland, was also linked to Joseph, and Makir, grandson of Manasseh. Issachar in biblical codes gave us Finni and Suomi several times over and in interlocked format. It also gave us Joseph, though at a lower significance. This could indicate a strong element from Joseph amongst the Finns, but with Issachar predominating. Now, it's also believed that the indigenous people of Mexico are the lost tribe of Issachar. So I will have a link down below if you want to check out that. It's very fascinating. But it does make sense. The Sami people would be of the tribe of Manasseh because of the similarities between many Native American tribes. Also, the Nephites, who came from Father Lehi, who came out of Jerusalem, mention in the Book of Mormon that they are of the tribe of Manasseh. So what is the meaning of the word Lapland, where the Sami people live? It means land of the midnight sun. Now, this name, Lapland, was given to the Sami people hundreds of years ago by European settlers, and it's a name that is still used today. It derives from the word Lap. The Scandinavians used this word to refer to the indigenous Sami people. However, the Sami people find the word Lapland offensive, and so they refer to that region as Sapmi. And then I came across this theory that says some linguists believe that both the words Sami and Suomi derive from the same Proto-Baltic word zeme, which was used to refer to land or territory and the people living on that land. Now, the origin of the word Lap is from Old Norse, from the word leper, and from Proto-Germanic, the word lapa and lapo, which means rag or cloth. When I think of that, I think of the connection of people who had leprosy, who were called lepers, and they were wrapped in rags and cloth. That's what came to my mind. It's also said to be of uncertain origin, possibly Proto-Indo-European, from the word leb, which means to hang loosely. There's also a claim that the word is the same as the modern Swedish word lap, which means patch, meaning that Laplanders are people who are so poor they have to patch their clothes together. Now, the word lape in Finnish also means edge, and so people thought that maybe they chose this word because the Sami people live on the edge of the upmost northern parts of that entire region. But then there's a theory that says they used to live more south and they only live up north because of the spreading of modern civilization and agriculture caused them to move northward. And it's been pointed out that there is striking similarities between the coats of arms of Lapland and and Lapinranta. Lapinranta is situated South Karelia, and its Swedish name is Vilmenstrand, which means wild man shore, which the author points out seems to be derogatory. But it's said that actually the Sami people of Sweden and most Sami people are very proud of this wild man symbol. To them, he symbolizes heroism, being very heroic and brave. And it's interesting that he is often depicted as having red skin. Here is the coat of arms of Lapland, and as you can see, there's the wild man and he has a club over his shoulder. And here is the coat of arms from Lapinranta, which is at the southern border of Finland. And as you can see, the wild man in this depiction has his club pointed to the ground, and he also has blonde hair, whereas the wild man in the Lapland coat of arms, he is darker. He's got the darker hair. This seems to support the theory that the people of the furthermost north, those Sami, had dark hair and bronze complexions, and the people that were more south had fair skin and blonde hair. Recently, we had exchange students from Taiwan staying with us, and so I took the time to do a little bit of cultural and history learning about Taiwan, and I learned that there is an indigenous people in the mountain areas of Taiwan called the Ami. Basically, it's the word Sami without the letter S. This picture right here stood out to me as there's those red and blue colors that reminds me of the Sami people. They make up 37.1% of Taiwan's total indigenous population. And unlike the other Taiwanese Aborigines, the Ami people have a history or a myth describing their migration as coming from overseas. Now this part was very fascinating. The Ami's people call themselves Pangka, which means people and kinsmen. Most Ami's people settled north of the Puyuma, who called these Pangka people the Amis, which means northerners or people of the north. According to the northern Amis, the Pangka people came from the descendants of deities, while the southern Amis believed that their ancestor was born out of stone. Now the name Ami has origins of Hebrew, Persian, Indian, and Japanese, as well as other origins. Now it's interesting, as you read the story of their myths or their legends, you'll see a lot of similarities from the Old Testament. You'll hear about a great flood that covered the entire earth. You'll hear about a brother and a sister who had to cover themselves with animal skins, and they were the only two people in the world. They were all alone. And they drifted on a boat to a land where they settled down and multiplied. And then there's mentioning of another land where a boy and a girl, a brother and a sister live. His name is Lutzi. Her name is Lalakan, which the L, when I heard Lutzi, reminded me of Lucifer. And this couple gave birth to snakes and frogs. It's interesting to see how at one point all of these tribes had that original creation story from the book of Genesis. And then over time, as they became scattered and lost, those stories evolved into the myths that they have today. And one more element to add to this discussion. A friend of mine reached out to me and she sent me this. She said, real quick, the whole Mulakites might have stopped in Ireland first discussion came up again tonight on a thread. One thing I brought up was the link between an ancient Irish writing and the letters of the Micmac tribe of New York. They share numerous letters the same. They are an Algonquin tribe. Those are the ones descended from the Nephite remnants. Anyway, I couldn't remember how to spell Micmac, so I was spelling it Micmac as two separate words as I talked about their connection to Ireland. The Northern Irish people went and settled Scotland, And Mac is used there to mean son of, or to denote which clan a person belonged to or aligned themselves with. That got me thinking, so I looked up what the meaning of Micmac is to their tribe, and it said it means allies. Just kind of an interesting connection. McConnell or McDonald, McAllister, son of, or tribe I'm allied with. And when I came across that, it was 12:44. Kept thinking to share it with you and kept forgetting. Latest thought of it came at 1:44. There's that number. So I thought I should share. Now, I mentioned the Micmac tribe in this video, and I mentioned Ireland, and this is interesting too because I've talked about in past videos recently about those clans from Ireland and Scotland, the McConnells, the MacDonalds. I talked all about that and the symbolism of that pertaining to some recent stories in the news and in our community. And then also I've talked about in past videos, in fact, I'll have some links down below, about that whole migration of the Mulekite people and how they went up to Ireland and then from there came to North America. And she shared this screenshot that says Mac is Scottish and Irish Gaelic. It's a surname prefix meaning son, and it's equivalent to the Anglo-Norman and Hiberno-Norman Fitz and the Welsh App. So if you see the word Fitz before a name like Fitzpatrick, it means the son of Patrick. She said, I guess it's used in Ireland too, which says its origin is ancient Gaelic, which came out of Ireland. Pretty interesting. Again, it seems to point to the Micmac tribe of New York being descendants of the Mulekites who at some point came from Ireland. Now, in the Book of Mormon, we learn that Mulek was the only surviving son of King Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah, and that his wife was with child. So Mulek was in the womb, and eventually he was born. Now, there are written histories in Ireland that Mulek traveled with the prophet Jeremiah. So about the same time, when Lehi left Jerusalem to avoid that destruction and took his people into the wilderness and then to the promised land here in North America, Mulek and Jeremiah went north up into those countries, up into Ireland, and then came from there to North America. And they came to North America around the same time that Lehi and his family arrived, and they built the great city of Zarahemla. Now here is a map of traced DNA of the Jaredite people or Adena people and the Nephite people or Hopewell people. So you can see over in Europe and the Middle East and also over in North America and Canada. So this is Haplogroup X, and where it's red, that's where it shows the greatest density. So we see this connection of the Jaredite people who left Babylon and Lehi's people who left Jerusalem and how they came to the New World. They came to the North American continent. You can also see how traces of these groups went all the way up through Europe to the north, clear up to Iceland. But even in North America, they seem to primarily stay in the northeastern regions around the Great Lakes and into Canada. My friend wrote, this is a really good map showing where maternal mitochondrial DNA X is located in the world. Note, the highest is around Israel and where the Hopewell tribes were located in North America. Next highest is where Jeremiah is said to have stopped with King Zedekiah's daughters, North Africa, Spain, and North Ireland. North Ireland are the Celtic people, and they spread into Scotland. She said, I've read archaeological reports that Haplogroup X was found in Hopewell burial grounds, but not one report of Adena DNA is out there yet that I can find. Rod Meldrum thinks they keep it hidden for a reason. They have the technology to extract it, and probably have, but have not published it anywhere that I can find. But there's plenty of evidence that the Hopewell arose while the Adena were declining, and the two groups may have mixed a bit. So this parallels the Jaredites and the Nephites. The Hopewell generally built their astrological mounds on top of Adena ones. In the Book of Mormon, you can see the Mulekites mixed a bit with the Jaredites. Their descendants are often noted as being large and mighty men. And there's tradition with philosophies of Jaredites, which are antichrists, and have words that link back to Jaredite words like Nehor. The map probably shows where the DNA tends to show up today, but mitochondrial DNA X has shown up in Hopewell graves. I think it was 25% of Hopewell graves in Ohio had Haplogroup X. So let's go back to this connection of the Native Americans and the Sami people of the North. The more I began to read about and study these indigenous people of the North, the more I began to notice the similarities between our own indigenous people here in America. Just as the native tribes here in America were driven off of their lands, persecuted, and forced to assimilate into American culture, it was no different for these indigenous people of the North. They too were driven off of their lands, persecuted, and forced to assimilate into the current culture. In fact, in 1894, the United States government initiated an immigration of Sami people to come immigrate to Alaska in an effort to teach the native Alaskans to herd domestic reindeer instead of continuing their indigenous seal, walrus, and whale hunting practices. What followed was a century of adaptation to America. Once Sami schools, like this one you're seeing in this photo, were developed, children learned English and American culture. In fact, these young Sami Americans were encouraged by their older generations to relinquish past customs and to accommodate themselves to American lifestyle as quickly as possible. And because of this, today we have over 30,000 people of Sami ancestry living in North America. Seeing that the Native Americans and Sami people have so much in common, I was really excited to learn that there have been times when these groups have come together to join their voices concerning matters that are very important to both of them, such as rights of Indigenous people and protecting their lands. Here is a photo of Russian Tsar Nicholas II with his cousin, King George V of England. Yes, they look like they could be twins. I was reading about this and learned that around 1917, that's when the monarchy in Russia that had been on the throne for about 300 years was overthrown. And once this monarchy was abolished, after this time, the Soviet Union was born. And under rule of the Soviet Union, this is when the Sami people experienced decimation of their nomadic lifestyle. Their villages were destroyed and they were resettled into collective farms. The government who had promised to accommodate them with jobs failed on that promise. As they continued to grow more alienated from their culture, they began to turn to other things such as alcohol and drug abuse in order to cope with the shame of being uprooted and the chronic unemployment, which plagues the Russian Sami to this day. And issues such as excessive industrialization, pollution, the dumping of radioactive material completely eradicated reindeer habitats, contaminated fishing areas, and killed off forest zones. And similar to the history of Native Americans here in America and how they were treated, the Sami of Norway, their children were sent off to boarding schools where they were never allowed to speak their native language, not even after school hours. These children were often ridiculed and humiliated for not assimilating properly. And circumstances weren't much different for the Sami of Finland and Sweden. In fact, not only did they experience racism, but Sami women underwent forced sterilizations because experts ordained that the Sami were prone to psychological deficiencies. These indigenous tribes were considered a threat and were also considered to be less human than everyone else. Now, I shared this screenshot in another video last year. There's that pay attention number 144. 144,600 Russians fled Russia to escape having to fight in the war. And these arrows point to where they went. They went to Europe, and then they went over into these northern countries, into Finland, Sweden, Denmark. But it feels like with all of these natural disasters and earthquakes and wars, it's kind of pushing people to relocate. It's pushing people to gather in, which I feel like is going to be preparing them for that great migration of the people of the north. So this search began for me in the scriptures. This is actually a book in the Apocrypha, 2nd Esdras. I'm just going to go ahead and read the verses. Starting in verse 40, it says, "These are the 10 tribes of Israel who were taken away into captivity in the time of King Hoshea. King Shalmaneser of Assyria captured them and deported them to a foreign land east of the Euphrates River. But the 10 tribes decided not to stay in that land among the many Gentiles. So they moved farther east to a country where no human beings had ever lived before." Now, this happened around 722 BC. So this is when the 10 tribes became lost. They were exiled and they moved out of Israel. And I remember always being fascinated by this group who moved to a land where no human being had ever lived before. So they became the first people in that faraway land. It says, there they hoped to keep their laws, which they had failed to keep in their own country. So they wanted to do right. They wanted to keep those laws and be a righteous people. It says, when they had to make the difficult passage across the Euphrates, God, the Most High, performed miracles for them and blocked the channels of the river until they had crossed over. Their long journey through that region, which is named Azareth, took a year and a half. Now, a year and a half will get you pretty far away from the land of Israel. And these people clearly wanted to stay true to the law. So these were, again, a righteous people. Now, it's interesting. We were reading in 2nd Esdras chapter 13. There is a parallel in the Book of Mormon in the Book of Ether chapter 13. This has always fascinated me. So let's go ahead and read it. It says, "And then also cometh the Jerusalem of old, and the inhabitants thereof. Blessed are they, for they have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. And they are they who were scattered and gathered in from the 4 quarters of the earth, and from the north countries, and are partakers of the fulfilling of the covenant which God made with their father Abraham." And I love this in verse 12. It says, "And when these things come, bringeth to pass the scripture which saith, There are they who were first, who shall be last, and there are they who were last, who shall be first." Now, this makes me think how this group of Israelites, they were the children of the covenant. They belonged to the house of Israel. They are one of the tribes. They were a covenant people. And over time, they have lost their identity. That's why we call them the lost tribes. They have lost their identity. They have forgotten who they are. And though they were once the first, they descend from Abraham. They were part of that covenant. They will be the last. They will be gathered in and taught the gospel, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and they will again enter into those covenants and become part of covenant Israel. I love that. And then we have another reference to this group of people in Doctrine and Covenants, section 133. It says, "He shall command the great deep, and it shall be driven back into the north countries, and the islands shall become one land." And it goes on to talk about the land of Jerusalem and the land of Zion, how they will be turned back to their rightful place. The earth will be as it was before the flood. And if you scroll down to verse 26, it says, "And they who are in the north countries shall come in remembrance before the Lord, and their prophets shall hear his voice, and shall no longer stay themselves, and they shall smite the rocks, and the ice shall flow down at their presence, and a highway shall be cast up in the midst of the great deep. Their enemies shall become a prey unto them." Now, this is a prophecy to be fulfilled before the return of the Lord. So we have this group of people from these northern countries who are supposed to come to Zion, come to the New Jerusalem in the last days before the return of the Lord. And they have this Moses-like experience where the Red Seas were parted and the children of Israel were able to escape, right? They have this similar experience where a highway is cast up out of the great deep and they are able to escape their enemies and make it safely to Zion. Now, I believe that this group of people at this point in time, when this prophecy is fulfilled, will have become covenant Israel. They will have entered into those covenants and received the gospel and been partakers of those ordinances. They will be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their enemies are hot on their trail, and they are escaping that oppression and that danger. They're headed to Zion. They're headed to New Jerusalem. And on their way, they have the Lord's protection. They have his priesthood power working on their behalf. Now, I want to quote from Gerald Lund's book, The Second Coming of the Lord. He talks about this group of people and sheds a little bit more detail. In reference to Doctrine and Covenants, section 133, what we just read, here's what he says. "Several things are of interest here. As we already noted, they who are in the north countries tells us that the Lord is not talking about the general process of gathering Israel, but the specific return of one segment of that gathering. Shall come in remembrance before the Lord could have a double meaning. First, the Lord is remembering the covenants he made with their fathers. Second, the people are remembering their commitments to the Lord when the missionaries taught them, or when they were baptized at 8 years old, or in the temples of the Lord, or the covenants their ancient ancestors made with the Lord, and their prophets shall hear his voice." Note the possessive pronoun here, their prophets, not just the prophets. This might be a surprise to some. Does that mean they have had prophets among them all this time? It doesn't say that, only that they will have prophets at this time. But identifying them as their prophets suggests that these are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elder McConkie commented on this phrase particularly and gave us an important insight. He said, "Let no one suppose that the 10 tribes, having been gathered by the elders of Israel, so as to return in a body, let no one suppose that because they bring their scriptures with them, let no one suppose that because prophets mingle among them, let no one suppose that any of this shall happen independent of the senior apostle of God on earth, who holds the keys of gathering and who is authorized to use them as the Spirit directs. There is one God and one shepherd over all the earth. There is one prophet, one presiding officer of the earthly kingdom, and he has rule over all the Lord's affairs in all the earth." So he says, this is an important point that is often overlooked. Moses restored the keys of the gathering of Israel from the 4 parts of the earth and the leading of the 10 tribes from the land of the north to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple. He goes on to say, to have other prophets, seers, and revelators somewhere on the earth that are totally independent of the keys held by the president of the church would be contrary to the order of priesthood authority. We are not suggesting that every one of the lost tribes who returns from the North countries will be members of the church. We expect that many good people will join them in order to find peace and safety. But the 10 tribes will come under the direction of the first presidency. As we have seen, we now have members of the church all around the world, including in those northern countries. So when the call comes for them to return, it will come from the same source that has the keys to gather Israel from the 4 parts of the earth. He says another scripture greatly expands our understanding of what the word prophet means. John the Revelator taught an important concept about the spirit of prophecy. In John's great vision, an angel stood before him, and John was so overcome with awe that he fell at his feet to worship him. But the angel said, "See thou do it not. I am thy fellow servant, and of thy brethren that have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." That is an interesting definition of a testimony of Jesus. But as we think on that, having a true testimony of Christ is the essence of prophecy. He says this tells us that those who have a testimony of Jesus are considered to be prophets, not necessarily ordained, set apart prophets, but prophets nevertheless. And he quotes the prophet Joseph Smith when he said, "They're prophets. Who are they? Are they to be holy men called from some unknown place and people? Are they prophets unbeknown to the presiding officers of the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth? Perish the thought! The president of the church who holds the keys to lead the 10 tribes from the nations of the north, wherein they now reside, holds also the keys of salvation for all men. There are not 2 true churches on the earth, only one. There are not 2 gospels or 2 plans of salvation, only one. There are not 2 competing organizations, both having divine approval, only one. Their prophets are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They are stake presidents and bishops and quorum presidents who are appointed to guide and direct the destinies of their stakes and wards and quorums. And then he goes on to say, we can safely assume that along with those stake presidents and bishops, there will be stake and ward relief society presidencies, young women presidencies, and primary presidencies, helping to keep the group moving forward. Once again, we are not given a lot of specific information, such as how many it will be, or if there will be more than one group. But knowing that there are thousands upon thousands of faithful members in those northern countries right now, strongly suggests that this is going to be a massive logistical undertaking. Now he goes on to talk about the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia being the place that makes the most sense to where this great highway that is cast up from the deep will most likely occur. And then he goes on to say, modern prophets have affirmed this again and again as well. In his work on the Articles of Faith, Elder James E. Talmage wrote, "The tribes shall come, they are not lost unto the Lord. They shall be brought forth as hath been predicted. And I say unto you, there are those now living," so he's giving a prophecy right now, "some here present, who shall live to read the records of the lost tribes of Israel, which shall be made one with the record of the Jews, or the Holy Bible, and the record of the Nephites, or the Book of Mormon, even as the Lord hath predicted. And those records which the tribes lost to man, but yet to be found again, shall bring. These records shall tell of the visit of the resurrected Christ to them, after he had manifested himself to the Nephites upon this continent. I love this. This reminds me of the videos I've done before where I've talked about those stories in the history of the people of Russia, where they talk about how Christ did visit them many years ago. He came and he visited their people. Though at this point in time, we don't have written records of this account and these experiences, we do have other things. We do have a stained glass window that tells of the story. We have lots of things that are shared from generation to generation within the history of the Russian people, where they talk about this, how this has been passed down from generation to generation, this story of how he came and visited their people. In fact, here's some artwork right now that I'm sharing on the screen that depicts that. So it will be so exciting when those records finally surface and we're able to add that to the scripture we have right now. So we have this testimony from the old world, we have this testimony from the new world, the Book of Mormon, and then we have this testimony of these lost tribes of these north countries. And those three books of scripture come together. I can't wait. And finally, he says, we are reminded that the 10 of those tribes are considered to be the lost tribes of Israel. So he's referencing that experience where Sister Wendy Nelson went and visited these northern countries. I think she was in Russia, and she asked who in the audience that day out of all those sisters were members of the different tribes of Israel. And she was able to find on her trip a member from every single tribe. All 12 tribes of Israel were present in those northern countries. And so he goes on to remind us that only the 10 tribes were lost. He says they are being gathered in with the rest of covenant Israel. But as part of that gathering, sometime in coming days, the Lord's anointed prophet will send out the word to the lost 10 tribes, saying, "It is time to come home." What is it about the direction north that seems so sacred? From song lyrics written about northern stars that point us in the right direction, to the ever-popular term true north, the direction that points towards the geographic North Pole, also called the celestial pole, which is located in the celestial sphere. This is where the true north direction can be approximated by the position of the pole star Polaris. This North Star is famous for holding nearly still in our sky while the entire northern sky moves around it. In many indigenous cultures, the direction north represents the trials people must endure and the cleansing that they must undergo. In the Turkish culture, the Turkish language associates different colors with the 4 directions. The north is thought of as black, the east is associated with blue, the south is red, and the west is white. And what's interesting in Turkish is that the seas surrounding the Turkish peninsula and Anatolia take their names from these color associations. The Mediterranean, which is called the White Sea, is west of Turkey, and the Red Sea is south of Turkey, and its waters are red. The Black Sea is north of Anatolia, and it's rich in iron sulfides, which gives it a black color. In China, the direction north is associated with the color black, as well as winter and a turtle. The turtle was considered to be a sacred animal and symbolized the universe. And in the black night sky, during the winter solstice, the northern lights were not an unusual sight for people living in the far north. These lights were said to be the rainbow bridge between heaven and earth. The Sami people believed that their ancestors lived in the northern lights and were a force of nature, like God, in line with the sun, moon, and other natural phenomena. It's important to be respectful of the northern lights in order to show respect to their forefathers. In Sami, the northern light is called Guv Sahas, which means the audible light, Many believe that they can hear crackling from the northern lights. And most globe makers agree that it's no accident that at the top of most globes, the piece holding it together is at the North Pole. The North Pole played an important role for astronomers and philosophers long before globes were popularized. However, for thousands of years, humans have noticed that the stars in the sky seem to rotate around a seemingly unmoving point with a nearby pole star. Ancient Greeks, medieval Arabs, and Renaissance astronomers celebrated it as the central axis of the universe, with all of the heavens rotating around this point. The explorers of the heroic age believed that to approach the North Pole was to come closer to the divine. What is known as the hem of God's robe has reminded the people of the North for centuries to look up. And just like the North Star, when we fix our eyes on God, who is constant, we will never lose our direction. He will show us the way. As I began this project months ago to begin studying the mysterious people of the North, I came to learn over time that these people of the North aren't that mysterious after all. There are over 42,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints between Russia and the Nordic and Scandinavian countries. And there will be many more to come as Israel gathers in. And in the words of the Lord as spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, for there shall be a day that the watchmen upon the mount Ephraim shall cry, Arise ye, and let us go up to Zion, unto the Lord our God. For thus saith the Lord, Sing with gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Publish ye, praise ye, and say, O Lord, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. Behold, I will bring them from the north country, and gather them from the coasts of the earth. And with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her that travaileth with child together. A great company shall return thither. They shall come with weeping, and with supplications will I lead them. I will cause them to walk by the rivers of waters in a straight way, wherein they shall not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. I have learned that there is so much truth found in the histories of so many of these indigenous tribes and these people of the North, and I have concluded that these are indeed the lost tribes of Israel, soon to be lost no more, as we are about to witness some of the greatest miracles and prophecy fulfillments in our dispensation, as the Lord turns scattered Israel into covenant Israel. I am optimistic that these promises will be fulfilled in our day.